A string of violent, high-profile crimes, including robbery and murder, occurred in January and February. These incidents happened in the Bay Area and New York City, with the victims primarily being elderly Asians and the suspects being black. News of these incidents circulated throughout social media, which generated substantial public outcry against violence and racism. Concerned citizens formed volunteer safety committees, while police and city leaders decried the violence. While the incidents generated buzz about public safety, some individuals are concerned about anti-black sentiment due to the suspects being black. On February 6th, a journalist on Subtle Asians Bay Area asked a question to the Facebook group. How can there be more unity and solidarity between Asian and black people in more visible and lasting ways? In what venues could Asian and black people support each other? This generated over 250 comments. Some of the comments were quite interesting to me, which led me to think about this episode. There were multiple answers, but they chiefly centered around concepts of allyship and examining anti-black tendencies within Asian spaces. I wanted to take some time to critique these two concepts and how they are actually unhelpful in building a left-wing program for broad egalitarian outcomes. The current discourse on allyship is hyper-focused on unity based on groupist or identitarian terms rather than shared political interest. It's a term that's thrown around a lot these days. One's positionality or centrality to the struggle determines your relationship to the group you are allying with. In other words, what you can or cannot do is dictated by your identity and how much privilege or oppression you face. Under this model, the most oppressed are the vanguard of the movement. They are the leaders who dictate the direction or the message of the organization. To someone outside of the oppressed group, their role is relegated to passively supporting or amplifying the organization's message. Individuals who are perceived as privileged due to their class background, race, sexuality, and so on, are told to fall in line and listen to the most marginalized of their organization. Although they're allies in the emotional sense, feedback and strategic thinking is generally limited or maybe completely monopolized by members who are considered marginalized. This stems from the association of persecution and injustice with identity. Because one is part of a marginalized group, whether it be LGBTQ, African American, women, undocumented, etc., their lived experiences with oppression give them the interpretive, intellectual, and political authority to guide the organization. If someone is white or part of a privileged group, their contributions should be directed to other forms of action as to not overpower, co-opt, or overtake the movement. Now, this is common in online spaces, social media circles, and organizational venues. You've probably heard phrases like, listen to black voices, listen to women, listen to queer voices, how to be a good ally, and we need to stand with X, Y, and Z, and so and so. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with working together and listening to marginalized people. But as the basis of organizational action and free expression of thought, it is self-destructive. Professor Adolph Reed compared this notion of allyship in current woke politics in general to a fraternity. One needs to unconditionally and uncritically follow a set of guidelines in order to participate. Otherwise, you'll be barred from joining. Kyle Kulinski from the Secular Talk radio show talked about the current embrace of, quote, purity of personal story, and how it's destroying movements for justice. Contemporary activists love disavowing or barring people from political work due to controversial statements or actions done in the past. What you said or did essentially taints your character, which automatically makes your current views or your allegiance questionable. This can be applied to identity and allyship. You can't speak up because you're too white. If you're Asian American, you can only do this. If you're from the suburbs, you have to do that. If you've supported so-and-so in the past, you can't join. Well, one of the most important, if not the most important thing for a movement or organization is expanding the base. This means growing your support and building relationships with people, especially those who are not involved in politics or maybe lukewarm to your agenda. Coalition building and support should be based on shared political interests, whether it be something like Medicare for all, raising wages, defending Social Security, raising taxes on the wealthy, and so on. As I've mentioned in my previous episodes, focusing on the needs and concerns of ordinary working people cuts across identitarian lines. It bypasses the problematic or divisive rhetoric about who is more oppressed, who can speak for the group, and who gets to decide. Now, simply put, if being an ally means being a cheerleader and saying yes to whatever you do, then I'm just going to walk away. Moreover, the conception of allyship erroneously equates racial identity with political constituencies. It assumes that groups like Asian Americans or Black Americans are cohesive, monolithic blocks with common interests. I'm going to talk a lot about Black politics because many of my readings focus on that subject, so just a heads up. Now, thinking about Asians or Blacks as a homogeneous group that act and vote the same way masks the diversity within these groups and their social relations within the capitalist ecosystem. I've always found it hilarious and contradictory that Asian Americans on Asian-centric social media groups like Subtle Asian Traits or Subtle Asians Bay Area celebrate the diverse experiences of Asians. They'll point to the rich and varied historical and cultural experiences of the Chinese, Vietnamese, Japanese, Indians, Filipinos, and so forth. Yet the same level of rigor in exploring the complexities of Black or white life, no pun intended, are curiously absent. To put it bluntly and perhaps simplistically, Asian American activists have a tendency to paint Black Americans as homogeneous, unitary, noble, and long-suffering victims of omnipotent white supremacy, while whites are portrayed as either active or unknowing participants in racial domination, regardless of their actions. There's also a naive assumption by younger Asian activists that all Asians will automatically align with other oppressed groups due to shared historical experiences of racism and discrimination. Academics like Cedric Johnson, Touré Reed, Adolph Reed, along with other scholars, have written extensively on the complexities and the shifting dynamics of Black political life. For example, Cedric Johnson's seminal paper, The Panthers Can't Save Us Now, which won the 2017 Daniel Singer Millennium Prize, along with his follow-up essays, critiques the way we look at Black politics and offers instead a real grounded, materialist take on Black political history and its relation to the changes in political economy during the 20th century. Likewise, Yale professor James Forman Jr.'s critiques of the popular book The New Jim Crow discusses the challenges of crime and Black support for carceral policies in Washington, D.C. During the George Floyd protests last summer, one must willfully ignore or remain aloof to the fact that many urban police departments, city councils, and administrations are diverse and integrated. These political actors continue to juggle the realities of crime, inequality, and shifting tax revenues with demands from their constituents and activists. Terms like allyship actually conceal these intricacies because it assumes that identity groups, including Asians, operate as a cohesive unit rather than people navigating within a capitalist system with their own wants, desires, motivations, and challenges. In the case of public safety and police violence, simplistic thinking actually prevents us from organizing adequately against the conditions that breed crime and the inequalities that police are utilized to manage. Lastly, it leads to wrong-headed, often race reductionist thinking on who the victims and perpetrators of injustice are. Allyship presumes there is a moral obligation for others to band together to fight oppression. Activists will often implore other persons of color that they have a responsibility to stand with the marginalized, especially regarding anti-racism or struggles against white supremacy. The death of George Floyd triggered massive protests throughout the country, and the attacks on Asian elders this year prompted a number of demonstrations against anti-Asian sentiment. Although it is admirable that many came together with the goal of defeating racism, there must be equal effort in determining the goals or the strategic direction of the movement/organization before we lend our support. Last summer, the vague and nebulous objective of anti-racism generated solutions that actually reproduced or strengthened capitalist logic. As Professor Cedric Johnson describes in his article, The Triumph of Black Lives Matter and Neoliberal Redemption, repugnant corporations with less than stellar credentials, with links to sweatshops, child labor, and vicious labor practices, poured millions into Black Lives Matter in the name of combating white supremacy, police violence, and racism. Even Republicans like Mitch McConnell or Mitt Romney, who are rabidly pro corporate, came together to denounce racism. Another solution proposed by activists included supporting black run or minority run businesses as a means of empowering the marginalized. This is laughably inadequate and reproduces the same forces that have destroyed the lives of working people everywhere, regardless of skin color, by shipping away jobs, crushing labor unions, privatizing public goods, and suppressing wages, etc., etc. Business owners also have conflicting interests with workers. They are generally opposed to regulation, minimum wage hikes, unionship, and other worker-friendly ordinances. But before allyship is given, we need to ask ourselves, what are the values that I hold? Does this organization have the same commitment? Are they fighting for policies I believe in? Will it effectively challenge power? This is more of an issue with an amorphous anti-racism white supremacy framing, but we have to be careful when signing on to an agenda that is unclear or unspecific. Enthusiasm towards defeating hate and prejudice is certainly important, yet we should be strategic and thoughtful about the organizations we join and the policies they claim to hold. The events of last summer, along with the violent incidents earlier this year, should invoke discussion on resolving poverty, police violence, inequality, and racism while improving general conditions and public safety. In Asian American centric spaces where I participate in, the conversations usually proceed with a question or call for action, until, as if on cue, a young, generally well educated, well off PMC type will tell others to examine their own anti blackness, their privilege, or their internalized whiteness. Now, I'm not suggesting that Asians are immune from prejudice or racism. Self reflection can be helpful for thinking deeply about our actions and how we respond to them. But self reflection is not politics. It is focused on the personal rather than strategic analysis or action. The self-reflection model doesn't tell us where racism or white supremacy come from. It doesn't give a causal account for the various injustices we face today: income and wealth inequality, police violence, homelessness, corporate power, state surveillance, and so on. Instead, the intellectual shorthand is used. Sweeping accounts of racism and white supremacy are used as explanations for a myriad of issues, often without substantial analysis or examination. Now, I've always found the demand of checking one's privilege or examining one's anti-blackness chock full of self-righteousness and self-flagellation. Again, this isn't to say there's no value in these actions. I think it is important to look at the way we are socialized and the impact of culture on our actions and how they may be harmful to others. Yet there's something strange about having to look inward before any political thinking or analysis can be done. Professor Stephan D'Arcy sums up this tendency. Quote, "It hides the systemic, institutional causes of injustice behind a screen of personalizing moral righteousness, and it eschews the development of strategies for winning, preferring instead to focus on the accumulation of social capital." End quote. There's an aspect of performance and marketing involved that increases one's clout and social value compared to others who have not confessed to their sins and ignorance. Admitting guilt is akin to reaching enlightenment. They are now ready to guide and lead others to intellectual or moral nirvana. Now, this kind of politics of self-righteousness is problematic, according to D'Arcy. Firstly, it turns the activist into a self-anointed saint. Secondly, it builds complacency because the individual believes they have little to improve upon. And thirdly, the person becomes an arbiter of justice, dictating what is wrong or right. This hinders movement building because it gatekeeps political activity. We can't start doing the work until you've sufficiently addressed your prejudices and biases. Now, there's also issues of practicality. How much self-reflection is needed? When do we stop? Who do we direct this tactic towards? Who are we trying to reach? What are our immediate and long-term goals? I do not recall anyone trying to answer these questions, and I suspect that purveyors of this kind of politics, if you can even call it that, do not intend to answer them. There's also a vague notion of what we should do next and what issues we should dedicate our energy towards. Generally, it boils down to banal and vapid suggestions of following XYZ on Instagram or Twitter, or donating to a local nonprofit or legal agency. I've noticed a general rejection of institutional channels like the police, city government, or the political process. Although there is much reason to distrust these institutions, I'm not aware of any cohesive or strategic plan put forth by some of these activists. I believe, perhaps cynically, that some of these individuals find it easier or more worthwhile to gather social clout while making moralistic statements. Lastly, because the whole idea of examining oneself is a personal matter, it doesn't actually challenge power. I am reminded of the late author, activist, and YouTuber Michael Brooks, who said something along the lines of, quote, "I acknowledge my privilege. Now can I keep my money?" End quote. Like corporate or neoliberal anti-racism, politics of self-reflection can be utilized to mask nefarious goals or to maintain structures of power. Last year, Jeff Bezos voiced his support for the George Floyd protests on Instagram, even commenting that he did not worry about his son being choked to death by police. He made his support clear by having the Amazon homepage read, "Black Lives Matter. Amazon stands in solidarity with the Black community." Yet during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, assistant manager Chris Smalls, who is Black, was fired when he led a walkout at Amazon demanding hazard pay and personal protective gear for fellow workers. Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and a host of Democratic lawmakers, draped with kente cloth, knelt at the Capitol for 9 minutes to honor George Floyd. Today, as we stand in silence rather than in a spoken pledge, let us reflect on those words, "justice for all," and what we need to do to make those words actually true in our time, remarked Chuck Schumer. These are the same pathetic Democrats who routinely scoff at policies like Medicare for all, minimum wage hikes, progressive taxation, and the Green New Deal, policies that would immensely benefit working people of all colors and creeds, especially Asians and blacks. Contemporary calls for allyship and self-reflection are common themes in activist discourse, so it's unsurprising someone would suggest a version of being a good ally, check your XYZ, or examine your anti-blackness, as an answer to the question of achieving Black and Asian unity. Yet, as common as it may be, we are no closer to the kinds of broad, class-based politics needed to challenge capital's deeply entrenched power. This requires abandoning moralistic notions of allyship that is both divisive and misleading, generating wrong-headed and simplistic assumptions about how we look at politics. Fighting for policies that benefit the greatest number of Americans calls for identifying and organizing against the forces that drive inequality and precarity. No amount of self-examination or self-reflection will bring us closer to the deep and powerful coalitions needed to push the struggle forward towards a more just and humane society.